Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and in this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the northern part of Ukraine because we received lots of very important updates from this area. Summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that the Russians began another major offensive operation, and the main purpose of this offensive is to force the Ukrainians to fall back from the villages on the territory of the Russian Federation and to take under control the village of Yunakivka. So let's discuss everything in details. First of all, and the most important, the Russians established the full control over the main supply roads, main supply arterias that go to the village of Yunakivka and to the Sumy borderland. In this video we can see how the Russians destroyed several vehicles that were trying to bring additional forces or to evacuate wounded from this area. We see that the Russians controlled this territory completely without any chances for the armed forces of Ukraine to carry out any task successfully in this region. And when the Russians established complete control, the Russians began offensive operation. Basically, the Russians broke through the Ukrainian defense belt and the Russians entered the village of Loknia from the north, and the Russians were trying to improve their positions as much as possible. But the Ukrainians managed to reorganize, to regroup themselves, and to carry out counter-offensive operation. And as a result of Ukraine counter-attack, they managed to stop the Russians and to capture several Russian soldiers. We have video that confirmed this. In this video that was published by the Ukrainian side, we can see very close combat between the units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation and Ukraine army. And as a result of clashes, the Russians were cut from the mainland and were encircled and captured by the Ukrainians. For example, this episode took place exactly in this area. Currently, we don't know for sure how many square kilometers the Russians control in this area and how many square kilometers are under complete Ukraine control. But we believe that the central part, the place where the Ukrainians captured the Russian soldiers, currently, as for now, as for the morning of the 8th of April of 2025, is under complete Ukraine control, but the territory to the north of this is under complete Russian control. We will analyze this video once again and then we will adjust the map, but we believe that something like this will be colored in the Russian favor during this upcoming of 8th of April of 2025. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Sumy region, in the Kursk region, in the Sudzha direction. According to information we have, the Russians continue their offensive operation on the territory of the settlement of Oleshnya. Today, the group of forces north made lots of very interesting and very important statements on their official Telegram channel. The Russians are saying that currently they are conducting assault operations in the village of Garnal and in the village of Oleshnya. Right now, the Russians are driving the Ukraine armed forces out of the last two small settlements that are formally under Ukraine control in the Sudzhan borderland. So the Russians are saying that currently they are forcing the Ukrainians to fall back from the settlement of Oleshnya. Currently there are very heavy clashes, and most likely today either the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm complete control over the settlement, or we're going to receive some video with the Russian flag. Furthermore, according to the same article, currently the Russians are attacking the Ukrainians on the territory of the village of Garnal. As for the village of Oleshnya, we have no doubts that the Russians are able to do this and that everything was developing exactly to this situation. But when talking about Garnal, we have a lot of questions because the village of Garnal is located very far from the edge positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation that were geolocated previously. Now let's discuss the situation here in details. As you can see, we have adjusted the map significantly because during the previous 24 hours we got a lot of updates that confirm Russian control over these huge territories. So first of all, let's compare the maps, and for example, right in front of your screens, the situation on the ground by the end of the 7th of April of 2025. The Russians established control for over more than 80% of the settlement of Guyevo, but we still had some doubts whether the Russians controlled this huge forest. And today we see that the Russians managed to improve their positions, and that reports we got, let's say, a few weeks ago that the Russians established complete control over this forest were correct. Now let's discuss in details, and first let's talk about the settlement of Guyevo. Today, the pro-Russian resources published this video, where we can see at least 2 or 3 Russian soldiers that were waving with the Russian flag. Based on this video, we haven't adjusted anything because the video with the Russian flag on the territory of this church was published several days ago on the roof of this church. Anyway, we got 2 more icons. These icons, for example, tell us that the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Guyevo by the morning of the 8th of April, and this information today was published by the neutral resources. And as for the update on the map, today the pro-Russian resources, more precisely once again the official Telegram channel of the Group of Forces North, stated that the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village of Guyevo. Having broken the stubborn resistance of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Russians liberated the village of Guyevo. Based on this report, based on the official statement of the Group of Forces North, we have completely adjusted the map in this area. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours, we see that the Russians were trying to attack the Ukrainian positions along the border. This video was published by the 129th Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and in this video we can see how the Ukrainians were trying to stop and to slow down another Russian offensive. In this video we can see a huge convoy that the Russians were using to attack the Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainians attacked the Russians and the Russian convoy with the use of FPV drones and artillery. Russians lost several vehicles, but the most important, the Russians managed to land infantry, and most likely currently the clashes are taking place for this huge forest, which is most likely under complete Ukrainian control. So when we turn back to this video, the Russians were attacking from the village of Guyevo in the western and then in the northwestern direction, probably with the purpose to attack this checkpoint. But the Russians, according to this video, were stopped somewhere in this area. The Russians landed infantry, and then the Russians most likely began offensive operation in the direction of this forest with the purpose to find protection against Ukrainian drones. So we see that the Russians are about to finish the battle for the Suja region, and the Russians will continue offensive operation further in the Sumy direction. Once again, before the next video, probably will adjust the map in the vicinity of the village of Loknia, and if this information once again is correct, if the Russians manage to dig in deeper there, then the battle for Hoptivka has begun officially. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Belgorod direction. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to force the Ukrainians to fall back from almost the entire territory of the village of Popovka. Today, the units of the 47th Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine published this video where we can see how the Russians were clearing one building after another. The Ukrainians were attacking with FPV drones the temporary deployment points of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. There are several episodes in this video, and based on these episodes we have adjusted the map in the most northwestern part of the settlement and in the most eastern part. So currently, according to these geolocations, we see that the Russians are trying to take the Ukrainians in pincers, and most likely we believe that in the very near future, probably during the 8th of April of 2025, the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back completely from the settlement of Popovka towards the border with the Russian Federation. So we see that the Russians are about to clear this area as well. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the southern Kupiansk direction or in the Lyman-Barovo direction. We have a lot of very interesting and very important updates from this area. Summarizing everything that took place during the previous nights, we can make a conclusion that the Ukrainian defense in this area collapsed completely, and not just collapse, the further defense belts began collapsing as well. First, let's discuss the situation in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Katerinovka and Nova. If you remember, yesterday the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians, more precisely the units of the Group of Forces West, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Katerinovka. And based on this report, yesterday we have adjusted this part of the front line. And today the Russians published the video how exactly the battle for Katerinovka was taking place. And for example, in this video, in the most final episode of this video, we can see how 2 Russian soldiers were raised the Russian flag in the most northern part of the settlement. This flag was geolocated, and this is exactly the point where the Russians raised their flag. Based on this video, we're not adjusting anything, we're just confirming the report we got yesterday from the Minister of Defense. Furthermore, when talking about other resources, like pro-Ukrainian resources, like pro-Russian and neutral resources. We see that there are lots of icons in this area, and according to them, according to these different mappers, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their position significantly around the village of Katerinovka. First of all, according to different articles, the Russians managed to cut 0526 road and basically to block the Ukrainians in the settlement of Novo from the north. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians improved their positions in the eastern part of the village of Novo itself. For example, this is the map by the end of the 7th of April of 2025. As you can see, the Russians were very far from these junctions of roads, and the Russians managed to capture just several buildings in the eastern part. But as for the beginning of the 8th of April, we see that the Russians improved their position significantly in the eastern part, including this company stronghold that was captured by the Russians. And as you can see, the Russians managed to cut the road 0526 physically. Furthermore, the Russians managed to maintain the lines between the village of Katerinovka and the village of Makeyevka by taking under control significant number of fields, tree lines, and the fortifications in this area. So we see once again that the lines of the armored forces of Ukraine are collapsing. As for now, they still haven't found any solution how to stabilize the situation, how to stop the Russians, and of course how to force the Russians to fall back. From the other side, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the village of Tarskoye. We've been talking a lot about this area for the previous several days, saying that the Russians answered the village, the Russians improved their positions, but without any geolocations. And today, by the morning of the 8th of April of 2025, the very reliable pro-Russian resources and neutral resources reported that indeed the Russians managed to answer the village of Tarskoye and to take under control more than 50% of this settlement. So we see that defense of the armored forces of Ukraine in this area has collapsed completely. Most likely during the upcoming hours, the Ukrainians will organize or try to evacuate their soldiers to the village of Zarechna through the river of Zhiribets. And most likely tomorrow, the Russians will take the village of Tarskoye under complete control. But telling the truth, maybe today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this information as well. So we see that the lines and defense of Barova Lyman has collapsed completely, and we see no signals, no signs from the Ukrainian side that they are able to stabilize the situation. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation around the city of Siversk. As for this area, the Russians during the previous 24 hours carried out a very successful offensive operation from the village of Zolotarevka in the direction of the village of Serebryanka, trying to outflank the Ukrainian positions in the village of Verkhnykamenska. This information was confirmed by neutral mappers, and this information was confirmed by the video published by the Ukrainian side. In this video, we can see how the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and how the Ukrainians were trying to stop the Russians with the drones and with artillery. But the Russians managed to move through the Ukrainian defense and to take under control significant positions, a significant number of Ukrainian positions, and the most important, to capture these tree line. Now the Russians will continue advancing further in the northwestern direction with the purpose to outflank the settlement of Grigorovka and to the settlement of Serebryanka itself. Let's compare the maps. This is the situation, for example, by the end of the 7th of April of 2025, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 8th of April of 2025. We believe that Zelensky was completely correct when he was saying that the Russians are planning to begin their major offensive operation in April, because currently we can see the consequences of the first days of this Russian major offensive. Now let's move further. And now let's discuss the situation in the city of Toretsk. Today, neutral mappers reported that the Russians managed to secure the western part of the city completely. Today, several pro-Russian resources reported as well that the city of Toretsk was secured by the Russians also completely. As for the Pokrovsk direction, the most important updates are coming from the village of Lysovka. Today, the Ukrainians, the units of the 25th Airborne Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine published this video, where we can see how the Russian soldiers were freely moving through the village of Lysovka. The Ukrainians were reconnaissing the Russian positions with the purpose then to attack them with FPV drones. In this video, there are lots of episodes, and two of them was geolocated. One of them was geolocated in this part along the Centralna Street. The second one was geolocated in this point. And furthermore, different mappers confirmed the Russian complete control over the village of Lysovka, and based on this video and based on these reports, we have adjusted the map completely. So we also believe that in the very near future, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm control over this territory, and then the Russians will begin offensive operation further in the northern direction towards the settlement of Sukhoy Yar and towards these pair of company strongholds that located right to the north of the village of Lysovka. The Russians by this attack will get as close as possible to the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration, and the Russians will be able to establish some certain control over the main supply lines and support of Ukrainians in this part of the cities. And that's it for today, for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds you we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.